one thing I think I want to hear your view on, because I think it's standing in the way between a lot of people's objective pursuit of truth, and it has to do with our cultural obsession. This might just be a Western obsession with the concept of identity, and sort of identifying as things and having that stand in the way between them actually questioning stuff. So, for instance, we're both atheists, we're both evolutionary biologists. That's not really coincidence. I copied him on both of those things. But I often think that this identity gets in the way of pursuing truth, because people are kind of identifying with conclusions. I don't identify as an atheist. I simply don't think the evidence for the existence of God is very convincing. I don't identify as an evolutionary biologist. I just went to school and got that particular degree and practiced it. But a lot of people are putting their identities in conclusions, which is maybe perhaps making it difficult to question these without triggering some sort of identity crisis. Do you see that?
Yes, I think treating people as members of a group to which you think they belong rather than as individuals, is that the kind of thing you're thinking of, where you treat people because they belong to a certain race or a certain sex or a certain political party, rather than treating them as individuals? I think that's a great vice, actually, which is coming to the fore in rather a big way in our present civilization.
One truth that you've dedicated much of your career to is defending the truth of evolution. Why is it so important for you that people accept evolution? Apart just from being true. I mean, of course, that's good reason to believe in anything. But what are we depriving ourselves of by failing to understand or accept?
I suppose it's because a living thing is such a stupendously improbable object. It really does demand an explanation, and it's quite extraordinary to me that it took until the 19th century before we had that explanation. When you contemplate any animal, it could be a human or any plant, it could be a giant redwood, and the sheer complexity, the beauty of it, the elegance of it, the fact that it has design written all over it, screams out for an explanation. And it's beautiful. The explanation that we have is wonderful. And we owe it to Darwin and others, and Wallace, and their successors. It's astonishing that it had to wait until the middle of the 19th century until we had this explanation. And I think it's such a beautiful fact that we can actually explain this otherwise mystery of the complexity and elegance and design of life. So I've devoted my life, I suppose, to expressing that wonder at this fact that we can explain this fact. So I can't imagine not wanting to spend my life doing that.
Good evening, Portland! How are y'all doing tonight? Glad to hear it. My name is Thomas Sheedy, president and founder of Atheists for Liberty, a 501c3 nonprofit organization that stands for free speech, free thinking, and freedom for all. So glad to have you all here tonight to see Richard Dawkins on stage. So, Portland is a series of bunch of different shows that are going on right now. Richard's going to be out in Vancouver next time, and I was told as the opener to try to condense my speech as much as possible into 5 to 8 minutes, so I've thought of the best way to try to do it, and here's how I'm going to frame this. I'm going to paint this as kind of a canvas, or rather a symphony for all of you. A little over 17 years ago, Richard Dawkins gave a speech down in Washington, D.C. about the new atheism, a movement that sprouted out that many of you know about due to the success of 4 great authors. And within that movement, he talked about a new age of reason, spreading across America, Britain, and Europe, and Australia, and even other parts of the world like South America, the Middle East, and Africa, where superstition had a firm hold. I was obsessed with seeing Richard talk about this movement, something so vibrant that could change the course of civilization as we know it. A British evolutionary biologist going out of his way to make sure that we lived a life based on reason and not religion. It galvanized me. It became a symphony in my head, with Melody Sheep turning that speech as well into an auto-tune music video. It was a symphony of science. And that symphony of being obsessed with Richard's success and the success of the movement kept playing in my mind years and years and years into all of this. It played in my mind when I was a high school student, nearly suing my school district 10 years ago to try to get an atheist student group established, fighting through 3 years' worth of red tape and bureaucracy to get what was needed. That symphony played in my head when, at only 18 years old, I became president of the Long Island Atheists out on the East Coast, getting 30 to 50 people into crammed back rooms of Panera Bread just to do any tiny thing I can to build this community that we were all building together across the nation. And it played in my head a few years after that too, when I helped found Atheists for Liberty, a national atheist organization that sought to use that energy that we all created together while simultaneously not canceling people, not dividing ourselves that we saw some of our colleagues do in years past. So I think this is going to be a great show tonight. I think you're all going to have a wonderful time viewing all of this. If you haven't picked up a copy of the Genetic Book of the Dead, please do so. I read bits of it already, and the illustrations are gorgeous, phenomenal. The illustrator's here too, by the way. If any one of you has the opportunity to meet them afterwards, you really should meet her as well. And I kind of know how the show's going to go. It's going to be really, really good because I was in the same position that all of you were in too. I was in the audience in Washington, D.C., where a very interesting question was asked at the end of the day, part of the Q&A session, about the future of the atheist movement. Richard Dawkins was asked if the atheist movement should continue to live and thrive and who its new leaders are going to be. Richard enthusiastically said that the movement should continue, but he didn't really know who those leaders were going to be, and I don't blame him. He spent half a century already fighting for scientific literacy throughout the West for all of us. He spent half a century fighting back against dogma. I don't blame him for not knowing who those new leaders are going to be at all. Well, for his sake and for all of you, let me try to at least answer that question. I believe that the next leaders of the atheist movement in this country and around the world are going to be people like our Vice President of Atheists for Liberty, Cherry Teresa, who's trying to reignite the old flame of the skeptic community based off of the works of Michael Shermer and James Randi. Leaders such as Jake Klein, an ever-emerging author and head of the Black Sheep, our Virginia State Director at AFL, who's trying to generate a vibrant community down in the DMV metro area. Leaders such as 17-year-old Emma Muniz, who is doing a fantastic job as our editorial assistant, but also publishing a great Substack channel of her own. I highly suggest all of you search her up and do that and go support her. And leaders such as Angel Eduardo, a person who is fighting back against crazies on the far left and the far right, and with great energy, great energy, like the Superman that he is. And many of you are going to be the leaders of this new movement too. Many of you who fill stadiums and concert halls to see a great man talk to you about scientific works that are changing the course of history. I truly believe that 100 years from now, Richard Dawkins will still be known, not just as the person who discovered the extended phenotype, not just as the person who coined memes, but as the person who put Western religions and Western superstitions to bed. And it's a great honor. It's a great honor to be here. It's a great honor to see him still coming here and still performing for all of you. His last step here, his last tour stop here in the United States of America. It's a real honor. Now, I'm going to tell you all about my good friend, Colin Wright. Colin has been a tremendous friend to myself. We've known each other for several years, and he has honored the accomplishments of the old, new atheist movement. He saw the movement go downhill, and he didn't let his love for evolutionary biology and for secularism stop him from doing what he needed to do. He's a successful contributor at Reality's Last Stand. He's the head of Reality's Last Stand, and all of you should go ahead and check that out as well. It's a wonderful, wonderful publication. And he has been the most supportive advisor on Atheists for Liberty's advisory board. So that symphony that I told you all about that's been playing in my head for many years, I hope it's been playing for all of you too. So without further ado, let's see the music that's on those sheets. Let's have a wonderful, vibrant conversation that you all can learn plenty of things from. Get copies of the book. And let's defend our reasonable civilization together. Now, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my good friend, Dr. Colin Wright.
Hello. Hopefully you all can hear me. So thanks, Thomas, for that. So Atheists for Liberty, they're doing fantastic work. You should definitely check them out and get involved if you liked what Thomas had to say. So thank you all for being here tonight. It's really impossible for me to express how honored I truly am to be here, sharing the stage with Richard Dawkins, especially as this marks his final event here in the US, possibly his last ever, his final bow. It's not an exaggeration to say that no one has had a greater impact on my intellectual and professional life than Dawkins has. In my early 20s, I was somewhat adrift. I lacked direction and deep passions. I had literally flunked out of community college. But then I stumbled across Richard Dawkins and his books and his lectures. The first book I read was The Ancestor's Tale, followed by The Selfish Gene and The God Delusion. And something really just clicked when I started engaging with Richard's content. I became totally captivated by evolutionary biology. So much so that I pursued it as a career myself, and I stand before you as an evolutionary biologist here today, all because of Richard Dawkins. So looking out at the audience, I imagine each of you are here for slightly different reasons. Dawkins' body of work is vast. He's dived into topics such as science, evolutionary biology, philosophy, religion, and even more recent culture war topics like critical social justice ideology or so-called wokeness. But I suspect that there is one thing that actually unites us all here tonight, and that's a deep reverence for the truth and the bold and unending pursuit of it. And I don't think anyone embodies that pursuit better than Richard Dawkins does. Whether he's challenging false beliefs by other evolutionary biologists on the units of natural selection, debunking creationism or intelligent design, arguing with theists over the existence of God, or questioning the claims of woke activists who are bafflingly denying the existence of biological sex, Dawkins consistently returns to two central questions, two extremely important questions. Is it true? And what is your evidence? Now, in 2024, I think deciphering what's true feels harder than ever. Our politics, especially in the US, is increasingly tribal and polarized. Social media enables falsehoods to spread unchecked and go viral. Free speech is increasingly under attack. And really, the social consequences for independent thought have never been higher, at least in my life. We desperately need an anchor to keep us grounded in reality. And that anchor is science. Not the science, but the scientific method. So the process of testing claims against objective reality to see what sticks. And it's also being comfortable in saying, I don't know, until evidence emerges. And in my view, there's no one better than Professor Dawkins to teach us the tools of science and critical thinking. So let's do just that. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to all get up and help me introduce Richard Dawkins. It is my great honor, and I'm sure he's your hero as well as mine. Please, everybody, get up. Richard Dawkins, everybody. Professor Dawkins, it is truly an honor to be here sharing the stage with you. I know you've done a lot of your tours with professional podcasters. These are essentially professional conversationalists. I'm just a biologist, so when I got an email from the people on your team saying, would you like your first interview ever to be of your intellectual hero live in front of thousands of people? So I said yes. So here we go. We're just gonna do this live. In my opening introduction, I mentioned
I couldn't hear. I may say I couldn't hear it, so I won't be able to respond to anything that you may have.
Oh, no worries. No. I'll
I should apologize for having a cold, by the way. My voice sounds a bit funny, and I hope I won't have a coughing fit in the middle of this.
I'm actually just getting over a cold too, and so is Thomas. So we're all recovering. So in my opener, I mentioned the thing that possibly binds all of us here tonight, because you've had such a vast career talking about so many different issues, which is, I think what binds us is the pursuit of truth, the reverence that we have for what's true. But that also sort of leads to the question is, well, what is truth? And why is pursuing it so important, if not one of the most important things that we can do?
It's rather a philosophical question, isn't it? What is truth? Unfortunately, in America at the moment, we're confronted with an object lesson in what is manifestly not true. And so I could answer it in a negative kind of way. What is true for me is what is true of the real world. I'm a citizen of the real world. I believe in the real world. And if you take the scientific view of the real world, things work. You get to the moon. You get to Pluto. You work out the ancestry of life. You look at the fossil record and you know when things happen. This is all the truth about the real world.
Yes, if you doubt what happens to be true, you can, take a step out of a high-story window if you want. You'll quickly learn about the truth of gravity that way. So it's really the thing that stays there even if you don't believe in it anymore.
And also was there before there ever were humans and will be there long after humans have gone extinct.
Yes, doesn't just rely on our perception.
Yes.
Okay, so is science the only way to discover truths about the universe?
I think science is the only way to discover truths about the universe. That doesn't mean it's the only way to discover moral truths, for example. What's right and wrong? What's beautiful? Those are different kinds of question. But to discover the truths about the universe, yes, the science is the only way. If there were a better way, science would adopt it.
I think I've heard you say before, when people talk about a scientific experiment not being perfect, or, oh, look at the bad things science has done in the past, and you've said that, well, the remedy for bad science, for a bad experiment, isn't to go ask your priest. It's not to go and throw some guts on the ground and try to read those or something, read some tea leaves. It's really just more science. You don't if you do bad science, the cure is just more better science.
Yes, that's of course right, and the test of science ultimately would be a repetition of the experiment, and In the case of physical sciences, this is done often, and if you've cheated, if you've lied, if you've done bad work, then it will come out. Science has in place methods of checking, methods of verifying the experiments that you've done, and especially importantly, methods of avoiding fooling yourself. In the case of medical science, this is especially shown in the double-blind trial, where if you're, say, comparing a new drug with a control, and the point about the double-blind trial is that neither the doctor nor the nurse administering the dose, nor the patient, nor anybody knows which is which of the experimental or the control dose, and that means that you cannot fool yourself. It's very tempting if you're a scientist to want a particular result to appear, and so you could not knowingly cheat, not deliberately cheat, but there are all sorts of subtle ways of cheating. The double-blind trial is a kind of gold standard to prevent self-deception, and science has distinguished itself by putting in place such techniques for avoiding deceiving yourself.
Yeah, because you're the easiest person to deceive usually.
Yeah.
You often are extremely invested in your question. I can remember back in graduate school, you write up your grant proposal, and in some sense you kind of want your cool idea to be true, but you really have to just put your biases aside and just go wherever the data leads you on this, and put in the protocols that you can to make sure that you aren't fooling yourself.
Yes.
Yeah, and so that's, science done correctly. At least that's what we should be expecting.
It isn't always possible to do it. I mean, it's all very well to talk about testing a new drug, but testing a new surgical procedure, I can't imagine anyone would want to be a control.
So I think we both agree that science is sort of not only the best, but the only game in town if you're trying to test truths about the universe. You talked about moral truths, but if we're wanting to know how the universe functions,
yes,
really science is all we have here. But there's a lot of people who try to protect their favorite false comforting beliefs by trying to allude to maybe other kinds of truth. So people may agree with you and they say, yes, truth is the most important thing, but science is merely one of many different ways of knowing. Particularly the cis hetero white patriarchal colonist kind that we're increasingly confronted with. Have you confronted people who are trying to push this sort of other way of knowing? I see it mostly in this area of
other ways of knowing.
Like
yes.
Yeah.
I've encountered this from time to time. I most recently encountered it in New Zealand, a recent visit to New Zealand, where it is now government policy to import Maori mythology into science classes in New Zealand. And New Zealand children are being taught, on the one hand, the Big Bang and DNA and proper science, what they call Western science, which is just plain science. And on the other hand, they're taught that it's all due to the union between the Sky Father and the Earth Mother, and whatever the local Maori myths are. And this is bending over backwards to respect the indigenous people, which that, of course, is a virtuous thing to do, but it's not science. And I think probably the same thing happens in this country, and perhaps more so in Canada.
Yeah, I was going to say Canada is definitely guilty of this. There's science museums they have in Canada where they have these indigenous science exhibits, where they have these objects, where they include warning labels for what they call objects of power. And they're not just talking about the myths behind them and how the people believe in them, but they're literally warning people who go into these museums of the powerful and how to approach them, and even the people after hours who are handling these things, how to approach them and handle them, because the power can just be overwhelming.
Yes.
It's just amazing how some of these myths, they're getting held up in these educational institutions, which are essentially creation myths a lot of the times.
Exactly.
Where they would have no qualms, they would have no difficulty seeing the issue with, Noah's Ark or something. They wouldn't think for a second that they would include something like that in their exhibit. but there's something about, I don't know if it's this overly romanticized view of indigenous cultures where they somehow get a pass on this. Either way, it's playing favorites.
That's exactly right. On my flight out of New Zealand, I was on the New Zealand Airways airline, and the literature on the plane talked about the spirits of the ancestors lifting the plane up, that kind of thing. I'd rather trust
engineers aren't working
Newton's laws and Bernoulli's principle.
Yeah, you mentioned, science is what keeps planes in the air. So if they were to start using the Maori myths, I think very soon they'd get a lot of complaints. One thing, and I still see it too, where people want to uphold these other ways of knowing. They often point to science and the mistakes and the flaws, and the fact that science is always kind of changing. What we held to be true 100 years ago is vastly different than what we view the world as today. Why should we trust the scientific method when the conclusions constantly change?
Well, they do change, and it's part of the virtue of science that it knows when to change. And Darwin encountered this when it was pointed out wrongly by the leading physicist of the day, Lord Kelvin, that there wasn't enough time for evolution to have occurred because the sun couldn't be that old. He was assuming that the sun was burning, a sort of furnace, burning something like fuel, in which case it couldn't be more than 20 million years old, and that wasn't enough time for evolution to take place. So then science came along later and realized that actually the sun is a nuclear reactor. So science does change, it does make mistakes, but it has its own procedures for correcting those mistakes. It's a self-correcting process, self-correcting method, and that's its great virtue. And there are many things which science already knows is true. It's all very well saying, as some philosophers do, that all we have is provisional hypotheses which are yet to be falsified. That's true to some extent. But there are some things that we actually know are true. I mean, we know that the Earth orbits the Sun, for example. That's not a provisional hypothesis that may be falsified.
Yeah. There's a difference between absolute capital T truth, and then we do have tentative truths. I mean, I guess you'd have to leave the slightest possibility open for heliocentrism being false. Just if you're sort of a brain in a vat being meddled with or something. There's always, but we could say, these are such implausible, improbable scenarios. We can confidently say that we have maximal certainty in certain things, like, the fact of evolution that change over time, the fact that the sun is the center of the solar system instead of the Earth. So we're not likely to overturn a lot of these main findings. And
Correct,
you can imagine a situation if you never change when you get new evidence in, well, that's unlikely to be correct at all. So science over time, the picture, starts out very fuzzy, and as it begins to be clearer and clearer, you might pick out things and be wrong at first, but as it gets clearer and clearer, you can start picking out things in the landscape, and it's changing, yes, but it's directional.
Yes.
In that change, I guess we're getting more precise. We used to think the Earth was much, thousands of years. And it went to millions, and now it's billions, and it's unlikely to go back to thousands.
Yes, right.
Anytime in the future here. One thing I think I want to hear your view on, because I think it's standing in the way between a lot of people's objective pursuit of truth, and it has to do with our cultural obsession. This might just be a Western obsession with the concept of identity, sort of identifying as things and having that stand in the way between them actually questioning stuff. So, for instance, we're both atheists, we're both evolutionary biologists. That's not really coincidence. I copied him on both of those things. But I often think that this identity gets in the way of pursuing truth because people are kind of identifying with conclusions. I don't identify as an atheist. I simply don't think the evidence for the existence of God is very convincing. I don't identify as an evolutionary biologist. I just went to school and got that particular degree and practiced it. But a lot of people are putting their identities in conclusions, which is maybe perhaps making it difficult to question these without triggering some sort of identity crisis. Do you see that?
Yes, I think treating people as members of a group to which you think they belong rather than as individuals, is that the kind of thing you're thinking of, where you treat people because they belong to a certain race or a certain sex or a certain political party, rather than treating them as individuals? I think that's a great vice, actually, which is coming to the fore in a rather a big way in our present civilization.
Yeah. So moving on a little bit from the topic of truth, I guess still sort of dwelling on a little bit, one truth that you've dedicated much of your career to is defending the truth of evolution. Why is it so important for you that people accept evolution? Apart just from being true, I mean, of course, that's good reason to believe in anything, but what are we depriving ourselves of by failing to understand or accept?
I suppose it's because a living thing is such a stupendously improbable object. It really does demand an explanation, and it's quite extraordinary to me that it took until the 19th century before we had that explanation. When you contemplate any animal, it could be a human or any plant, it could be a giant redwood, and the sheer complexity, the beauty of it, the elegance of it, the fact that it has design written all over it, screams out for an explanation. And it's beautiful. The explanation that we have is wonderful. And we owe it to Darwin and others, and Wallace, and their successors. It's astonishing that it had to wait until the middle of the 19th century until we had this explanation. And I think it's such a beautiful fact that we can actually explain this otherwise mystery of the complexity and elegance and design of life. So I've devoted my life, I suppose, to expressing that wonder at this fact that we can explain this fact. So I can't imagine not wanting to spend my life doing that.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's what got me into, I think, evolutionary biology as well. Just the way it sort of eats through these old beliefs. It turns what may seem miraculous into something that's tangible that you can actually wrap your brain around. It's always really difficult to wrap your brain around things like deep time, but you can do your best. And
it's an astonishingly simple idea. I mean, Darwin's idea is really very, very simple. If you express the power of a theory as that which it explains divided by that which you need to assume in order to do the explaining, it's a colossal ratio, because what it explains is everything about life, the complexity of life down to the cellular level, down to the biochemical level. It explains everything, and yet the theory itself is ravishingly simple.
Yeah, it's a fundamental aspect of who we are. I mean, down to every cell, everything about us has evolved through this unbroken chain since billions of years ago. And so one reason that I am captivated by the topic too is because denying something that is really so fundamental to who we are as a species, as mammals, as living organisms, you can't really operate too far in the world basing your views on something that is just so fundamentally wrong to the core. I mean, we can see this in medicine. If we base medicine on the idea that we were specially created, that's probably not a good way to go. So there's many practical reasons also to believe, to have people accept evolution as well.
Yes, I suppose it was possible to be a doctor before Darwin. There probably were some quite good doctors, including, by the way, Darwin's father and grandfather. But yes, if you haven't the foggiest idea why we exist, why anything exists, it does rather hamper you, I think.
Yeah, it also addresses, I think maybe like no other science, astronomy might get close, but some of these big existential questions of existence, like if you have a penchant for big philosophical questions, who we are, where do we come from, where we're going, why do we behave this certain way? I mean, evolutionary biology really gets as close as you can to real tangible answers.
It was these sorts of considerations that led me into biology in the first place. Yeah. Most of these students that I've taught, if you ask them why they came into biology, it would be that they were naturalists, that they were like Darwin. I mean, they were bird watchers or bug hunters or botanists. But I wasn't like that. I was never much of a naturalist. It was always these existential questions that drew me into the subject.
Yeah, I find the same thing for myself. I used to go on these birding tours. I took a bird class when I was at UC Davis, and I thought it was actually quite torturous being in the car when everyone would be so obsessed with the next bird that they would go to, and then spend 10 minutes looking at that, and then we'd move on to the next, and a minute later we'd see the same bird, and we'd dwell on that same bird for another 10 minutes. And it was just like that. I was like, can we just see it?
I've come round to that. I mean, I quite like doing that, but
maybe I will too.
But I'm not good at identifying. I'm hopeless at actually knowing which bird is which.
Yeah, that's kind of like the stamp collecting version of science. Learning all the birds, and I mean, it's good to know all the naturalist stuff. But yeah, I was more into it for the philosophical reasons. You've spent a lot of time debating creationists and intelligent design supporters. The creation ID versus evolution debates seem to have kind of fallen off, at least since you released the God Delusion. Probably due to big court cases like Kitzmiller versus Dover, and also probably people like you who've just devoted your career to writing books, demolishing some of these bad ideas. But I can't help but feel, and maybe I have no data to support this whatsoever, it could just be that I'm too much on Twitter and X, and ever since Elon bought it, there's been a sort of a demographic shift. But I get this growing sense that the evolution wars are gonna spark up again. Maybe not right now, but the next 5 years. Do you have that sense at all, or is this just me being overly paranoid?
Well, I hope you're wrong about that. I was not actually involved in the Kitzmiller case, and I met one of the lawyers on our side. And after he had a long conversation with me, he said, well, thank goodness you weren't called as an expert witness on our side.
Could you have been too strident?
Well, the reason was that their strategy was to, as it were, reassure religious people you can still keep God and be an evolutionist. And I would have given the lie to that. And would have probably lost the case, therefore.
Yeah. There's a time and place for everything. Yeah, you got to take the little victories where you can, So, I agree. One reason I think that I'm concerned about this resurgence, again, I'm too online for this stuff, but the former Fox News host and political commentator Tucker Carlson, he recently went on Joe Rogan. And he talked about, I like Joe, but he, they both have the biggest podcast ever. I mean, sometimes Tucker's is the number one podcast, Joe's is routinely the number one. But Tucker said some insane things about evolution. Were you aware of the things that he said?
I did read about it. I've forgotten what he said, perhaps wisely.
Well, I have it written down right here, and I'd like to read that to you. So it was a very brief interaction, but I think it'd be good to hear your response to these, because it's just ludicrous to me that these arguments are still around, given your work and how much progress we think we've made on these. So here's what Carlson said. He said, this is after Joe sort of mentioned evolution, and they had a quick back and forth, like, is it real? He said, you can measure adaptation, but there's no evidence that evolution. In fact, I think we've kind of given up on the idea of evolution. The theory of evolution, as articulated by Darwin, it's like kind of not true. Then Rogan said, in what sense? And then Carlson responded, well, in the most basic sense, the idea that, all life emerged from a single-cell organism, and there would be a fossil record of that, and there's not. There's a ton of record of adaptation, and you see it in your own life. I mean, I have lots of dogs. I see adaptation in dogs, litter to litter, but there's no evidence at all None. Zero that people evolved seamlessly from a single cell amoeba. No, there's not. There's not a chain in the fossil record of that at all. You hear people make reference to evolution because that theory of adaptation is clearly true, but Darwin's theory is totally unproven. That's why it's still a theory, almost 200 years later. So there's... so, soak that in for a second. I think there's three main claims in this. So one is that we've kind of given up on the idea of evolution. It'd be interesting to know who we are. But is the theory of evolution as articulated by Darwin kind of not true? I mean, come on.
It's wonderfully true. I mean, it's being verified daily, weekly, all the time, ever since Darwin's time. The evidence is absolutely massive. And what was that about amoeba? Does he think we evolved from an amoeba?
Apparently, yes. Yes.
Well, that's about 100 years out of date.
Yeah, I haven't. I was at a graduate school in 2018, so I haven't been there for about 8 years now. But I think they probably still believe in evolution. A lot's changed, perhaps. So the second thing, yes, he said we emerged from a single-cell organism, and there would be a fossil record of that. But there's no evidence at all that people evolved. Maybe this is a weasel word. Seamlessly from a single-cell amoeba. He seems to be looking for a seamless.
Well, you would not expect a fossil record of the single-cell ancestor. Anyway,
It's a lot of excuses you're making.
We're lucky to have fossils at all. I mean, it's an extremely fortunate accident that fossils do exist. If we had no fossils at all, if there wasn't a single fossil anywhere in the world, the evidence for evolution would be absolutely cast iron. We do not depend upon fossils.
And plus, if we needed to have this seamless, array perfectly leading up, I mean, when you mentioned that this isn't what we would expect. Things are difficult to fossil. We're lucky we have as many fossils as we do. But if your standard is seamless transitions, like, okay, let's see, suppose you have somewhat of an array, but you have a gap there, which you're going to have. If you fill in that gap, if you do the research and you find out where you need to dig based on the plate tectonics, what rock formation based on geology, let's say you find that transitional fossil.
Then there are two gaps.
There's two gaps.
Yes.
So this makes it worse for us. So we shouldn't.
If we really did have a seamless transition, if every species that ever lived was preserved in the fossil record, it would be a remarkable thing. It would be impossible to give species names to all these fossils because they would seamlessly grade into each other. It's only the fact that almost everything has gone extinct that enables us to give separate names to animals at all.
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't expect to find that exact through line through time too, because of the branching pattern of evolution. You're probably going to find sister species that are in the fossil record. So, I mean, you can only make this claim for wanting this.
Yes, there are very few cases where you actually do have a progression in the fossil record that you can see completely seamless. I think there's one case in diatoms, single-cell plants, where I think it's in Yellowstone. There are, if you take cores samples down through Yellowstone mud, you find an actual seamless transition as these diatoms evolve. But that's very rare. Normally we have one here, one there, and there are big gaps between them inevitably.
Okay, and then Tucker's final thing. Darwin's theory is totally unproven. That's why it's still a theory almost 200 years later.
I think we've got to stop calling it a theory.
What should we call it?
It's a fact. The word theory is misleading. Scientists sometimes say that the word theory is used in a different way. In popular culture, theory means something tentative, like hypothesis. And scientists use it in a different way, but I prefer to abandon the word theory altogether in this case and say evolution is a fact.
I agree. The word is abused way too much. So yeah, I'm all for that.
Yeah.
So after Tucker made these comments, the internet seemed ablaze with people who were emboldened by these claims to just, follow these ideas. And my DMs were just filled with people going crazy. How does it make you feel that these arguments, which have been, you've personally debunked in all of your books countless times, they still persist? I mean, their arguments, I guess they're so anti-evolution, their arguments haven't even evolved at all either. They just keep using the exact same ones.
They were emboldened because Tucker, what's his name? Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson is some kind of authority, is he? I mean, some kind of expert?
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's what we're dealing with right now. So maybe it's just this microcosm of the online world, but I do suspect we're going to have another evolution war, and I guess I'll have to. I know what I'm going to be doing 5 years from now. You weren't always battling. I mean, I guess you were for a long time. Creationism and ID. Now, I guess a little bit more of the woke activist persuasion, which we'll get into a little bit later. But you were actually a practicing evolutionary biologist, writing peer-reviewed papers. The debates that you had when you were an active evolutionary biologist, I think these were some of the most fascinating debates ever. It wasn't so much the big questions and like, oh, look at evolution. It's amazing, the apparent design. I mean, that's cool too. That's good to draw you in. But what really got me into it was the debates that you specifically had, the back and forth intellectual volleys between, I would say, you and now the late Daniel Dennett, and then on one side, and then Stephen Gould and Richard Lewontin on the others. I suspect the audience might be a little familiar with these because you do allude to the debates around group selection and individual selection. They're a little esoteric, but I think there would be of wide interest when people understand these. Can you kind of just explain, I guess, very briefly, the main disagreements you had with some of these other giants of evolution, the battles that you used to do?
Stephen Gould was a brilliant communicator, and I think many Americans learned what they know of evolution from his essays, which are beautifully written. He, like me, he was filled with wonder at the living world. His main disagreements that we had, well, I suppose, punctuated equilibrium, the theory that he put forward with Niles Eldridge, the belief that as you look at the fossil record, you get apparent jumps, and they argued that these jumps are real and they are not to be glossed over, just sort of not just missing data. They really are jumps in the fossil record. They believed that there were periods of stasis where no evolutionary change happens, and then a sudden jump to a new form. Now, Gould, especially in his later writings, I think confused three different kinds of jump, which had nothing in common with each other except they were all jumps. And so they had a kind of poetic resonance with each other. The three were macromutation, that's to say a single mutational step where a child is radically different from its parent. So that's the first kind. The second kind was...
Hopeful monster?
Yes, hopeful monster. That was Goldschmidt's term. The second kind of jump was the result of mass extinction. So you had... the dinosaurs went extinct, and immediately that opened the way for very rapid evolution by mammals. And the third kind of jump, which I think is the main one that Eldridge and Gould originally intended, was followed from the dominant theory of speciation, the dominant theory of the way new species come into existence, which was geographical. The idea is that you have a population of animals, say, on the mainland, and an island, and some of them got to the island, and on the island they evolved in a different direction, perhaps because of random drift, perhaps because of different selection pressures on the island. And then if they came back to the mainland later, they would by then be different because they'd evolved differently on the island. So it would look like a jump. It would look like an evolutionary step change because all the evolutionary change had taken place on the island. And if you dig down on the mainland, it appears to be a sudden jump. Well, those are three different kinds of punctuation, which I think Gould especially muddled up in his later writings. He also espoused the idea of multi-level selection. Selection not only works at the level of the individual, but at the level of the group. He thought that it was too restrictive to do as Darwin did and treat natural selection as choosing between individuals within a species. He thought you also had to consider selection between groups, between species. He wrote a fascinating book called Wonderful Life, which I would criticize. It was about the Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion was a period in the Cambrian era about 550 to 520 million years ago, where, according to Gould, a whole new flowering of different body types, different phyla, suddenly arose, again as a kind of jump in evolution. And I think what's wrong with that, it's a beautiful poetic image. It grabbed people. It grabbed people's imagination. What's wrong with it is that he was kind of implying that because in that period of the Cambrian, many of the phyla, the major animal groups, arose at that time. It looks like a jump, but that's arguing with hindsight, because you only recognize these different animals as different phyla by reference to their modern successors. It's as though a gardener were to look at a tree and say, isn't it funny? This tree in recent years has only put forward new growth at the twig level. There have been no new major boughs. Well, that's obviously stupid. I mean, of course there'd been no new major boughs. The major boughs had to start a long time ago. I think that's the error that Gould made in Wonderful Life, which, if he didn't make that error, he, as it were, laid himself open to other people jumping on that error.
Yeah, he did have that obsession with all the jumps being real. And I remember your criticism you had is you said, he was criticizing you, trying to say that you're for this gradualism, but your response was that, well, gradualism doesn't mean constant speedism. You can still have something that appears very rapid, in a geological timescale. We could still be talking about millions of years. Doesn't mean the intermediates aren't there, but about fossils are very difficult to come about, and so you can see these apparent jumps when maybe they don't actually exist in real life. And
by the way, Darwin said the same thing.
Yeah, he was dead set on the jumps being very real, and I don't think he was very convincing of that. I want to touch on your new book, The Genetic Book of the Dead.
Yes.
So eventually, you had these debates in the sciences and evolutionary biology. You kind of then pivoted and got more into educating the public about evolutionary biology. Your books have covered a lot of ground, from evolution and religion, cultural criticism. As someone still working on their first book, what pressing thing did you feel you needed to get out for your 25th? What book is this for you?
Well, I haven't changed my views since I started the Selfish Gene. Somebody last night really suggested that these were bookends for my career. So it is called a Darwinian reverie. It's taking the ideas of the Selfish Gene and looking at them in a different way. What I've striven to do in all my books on evolution is to put forth the idea that natural selection is differential survival of genes. And the organism is a survival machine, as I originally called it, for the genes that ride inside it. And if you take that view, you get the right answer when you're faced with some kind of conundrum. So that's the view that I've been pushing, and it runs right the way through this new book as well. The new book, the new thesis that I'm putting forward is that because any animal, is a product of natural selection, of its ancestors, there should be signals from the past in the body of the animal and in its genes, which could be read, probably by a future biologist, as a written description of the worlds in which its ancestors lived. So I've called the Genetic Book of the Dead. The Genetic Book of the Dead is a written description which you could read from the body of the animal and the genes of the animal, describing the ancestral worlds in which the animal ancestors lived. And I can quote from Darwin, which a sort of inspirational passage. It may be said that natural selection is daily and hourly scrutinizing throughout the world every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and insensibly working whenever and wherever opportunity offers at the improvement of each organic being. So, because the animal is a product of that process of scrutinizing throughout its ancestral past, we can read the animal as a description of the selection pressures that led to its being there. It has to be a palimpsest. A palimpsest is a document which is written and then overwritten and then overwritten and overwritten again, because of course you've got descriptions of the ancient past and the more recent past and the more recent past and so on. So that's the thesis of it. I illustrate it with, in the first place, by camouflaged animals. Things like there's a lizard. And I've got a picture of a lizard from the Mojave Desert, which has a beautiful painting, almost you could say, almost beautiful picture of the desert on its back. On the back of the lizard, you can see tiny stones and sand grains. It just looks like desert. And that's true, the same kind of thing is true of any camouflaged animal. And what I'm trying to argue is that's just the skin, the outer skin of the animal. The same thing must be true right the way through the interior of the animal as well. There's no reason why natural selection should confine itself to the outer surface of the animal. It will be exactly the Genetic Book of the Dead. In principle, could be read right in the middle of the animal, in the cells of the animal, the biochemistry of the animal, no less than the skin, which actually looks like desert. If you had the right tools, and the zoologist of the future will have the right tools, she could read the interior of the animal as well as saying desert, as well as the exterior of the animal.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful. The inside versus outside of the animal is a powerful way to look at it, because it should be no surprise that we see organisms and they look, they can look quite magnificent. They can have camouflage. They can look like leaves. They can look like the desert. But of course that they look interesting ways is because they've evolved in an environment where there's eyes that are looking at them, either looking at them to try to mate with them or to try to eat them. And so, this makes sense in the world when you essentially have all these cameras around you that are trying to either, potentially trying to kill you. But the inside, we might just see a bunch of guts, but there's, as you mentioned, there's no reason to think that they're not as finely tuned as the outside of an animal to eyes, but they're obviously going to be tuned to something like, more function and things like that.
Yes, thank you. You put it better than I did. Thank you very much.
So the one thing I love in your book is how it goes, well, the analogy of the palimpsest and how there's different layers to it that you mentioned. Oftentimes there's lower layers, and I guess those would be, I think you would say that those layers have been written earlier in development, so they're maybe harder to overturn later on, where some things are written sort of on the very top, the last
Yes.
thing written on the palimpsest, maybe fur color or something is easily changed, it's easily
Yes.
erased and written over, but something like, the body plan for tetrapods, that's not something that you can easily just
No.
go back
right.
and fix. Is that mainly developmental that causes
It is,
the
yes, I think.
layers?
Yes, I think there is a sense in which things like the tetrapod body plan, the backbone, and so on it's very hard to get rid of because it affects the early embryology. There are examples. I mean, I got a chapter largely about crustaceans, where the body plan is a segmented, it's like a train, but there's some parasitic crustaceans which you wouldn't know are crustaceans at all. I mean, there's Saculina, which is a parasite on crabs. It's actually a barnacle, but all it is a great sac clinging to the underside of the crab, and then a ramifying, sort of rather like a tree inside the crab. There's a picture in the book of if you swept away everything except this wretched parasite Saculina, it looks like a crab because the branching fibers go right into every bit of the crab, and so it looks like a crab, and all you see on the outside is this sort of horrible great bladder. So it is possible for the major body plan to disappear.
I think it's a fantastic analogy, and I think everyone needs to pick up a copy of this book. It's I think is one of your best. The time is flying by up here. I'm realizing I would like to move on to a topic that we both share in recent years and months. We've talked about creationism and intelligent design, Tucker Carlson's confusion about evolution, but we're kind of used to that. We're kind of used to attacks on biology coming from, I guess, the very religious right of things. But over the last decade, I would argue that some of the most overt biology denial is coming from where we have not really expected it. It's coming from maybe the political left and actually within universities when it comes to the topic of biological sex. So when I pushed back against creationism and intelligent design when I was in academia, it was nothing but praise by colleagues. But as soon as I started pushing back against their claims about sex being a social construct, or there's maybe 5 sexes, or it's a spectrum, I was basically called a bigot. He wasn't met with the applause that I was when I talked about intelligent design and creationism. Really, it was, I think in 2015, there was an article in Nature that came out that is kind of what woke me up to a lot of this. It was called Sex Redefined. And it said that biologists think that sex is much more complex than just male and female, that there's a wider spectrum than that. I don't remember anyone getting awarded a Nobel Prize for the sex spectrum discovery, so that was a little weird. There's been a lot of journals that come out now and talk about animal sex being multimodal. New York Times talking about, why sex is binary. And everything really published in Scientific American now on the topic of sex seems to be completely filled with pseudoscience on this topic. It's kind of rooted in this idea of postmodernism that holds that truth is relative, and then mixed with queer theory, which believes that categorization itself is an inherently oppressive act. I know you've been aware of this, you've written on it. When did you first become aware of this issue of this denial of male and female, of biological sex?
I can't remember when I became aware of it. I think it's pernicious. I mean, sex is binary. It's one of the rather few binaries we've got in biology, actually. Biology is full of spectra. There's no divide between large and small, tall and short, black and white, clever and stupid. I mean, these are distributed as a continuum. The one thing that isn't is sex. Sex is absolutely a binary. Throughout the animal and plant kingdoms, everything, every creature is either male or female, defined by their gamete size, either microgametes or macrogametes, sperms or eggs. This runs right the way through all animals, even if they're hermaphrodites. Some of them are hermaphrodites. They have both male and female gonads. They produce both microgametes and macrogametes, so that they are in parts of them male, in parts of them female. That's quite different from saying that there's a spectrum. There are no intermediate gamete sizes. There are no mesogametes, halfway between macrogametes and microgametes. There are lots of different ways in which sex is determined. In mammals, as you know, it's the XX-XY system. In birds, it's the same kind of system, but the other way around, because it's the equivalent of XY, which is the female in birds. In mammals, it's the male. In some reptiles, it's determined by temperature. In some fish, it's determined socially. So there are lots of different ways in which sex is determined, but the definition of the male-female phenomenon is in terms of anisogamy. That's to say the difference in gamete size, which is ubiquitous throughout the animal and plant kingdoms. If there are philosophical positions applying to humans which for some reason want to make humans unique and separate, then this is a very parochial, local kind of thing. It doesn't work for the whole of biology. The whole of biology is filled with sex as a straightforward binary. Now, I have no idea why this is why the idea that sex is a spectrum is so appealing, and particularly have no idea why it appeals to editors of so many scientific journals. It seems to appeal to very, very young people. I think it's bullshit.
Yeah, I of course agree. I think the thing you stressed that I think can't be stressed enough is this distinction between how sex is determined with how it's defined, because those get conflated. People, when they say determined, sometimes they think that means defined. Sometimes they want to define sexes by their chromosomes. I usually like to say, we have all these sex determination mechanisms which are not binary. There's so many different ways that organisms have evolved in order to send their the animals down a pathway that leads to the development of being male or female. But then at the end of the day, no matter what pathway, what the mechanism was, you still have males and females. And then you have everything else. You have all the downstream consequences of sex, such as we call this sexual dimorphism. We have differences in height. We have, male deer grow the antlers. They have different hormones going through their bodies. And that stuff isn't binary. Their behavior is not binary.
Yes.
Really, the only thing in this whole process that's binary is that middle area of what sexes are. And the mechanisms that determine it are different, and the downstream consequences are also very different.
I mean, there is what you can make a distinction between sex and gender gender is very poorly defined, but it's arguable that there are people who have a sort of psychological dysphoria, it's called, where they feel that they've been born into the wrong body. This is a kind of dualism, that their body may be male, but their soul is female, is sort of lurking inside. And I have sympathy with that. I mean, if there are people such as Jan Morris, whose book I read really long ago. You asked me when I first became aware of this. This was in the 1970s, I think, that Jan Morris wrote her book, Conundrum. And she felt, but when she was James Morris, she felt she always really was female, and eventually had the hormone treatment and the surgery and so on. So I had a lot of sympathy with that. What I don't have sympathy with is people who are biologically male with the muscular advantages of being male, sashaying into female athletic events and carrying off gold medals, which is just cheating.
Yeah, so we're going to have just a couple more questions. So we're going to have a Q&A after this. It's going to be a 30-minute long Q&A. But if you want to ask a question, there's a mic over there, and you're going to need to start lining up over there now, because we got about 4 more minutes of on a question. So if you want to ask a question, start lining up over there. Okay. I guess I have time for one more question for you. So actually, since this is going to be the last question. So there's going to be a meet and greet for ticket holders. So if you're here for the meet and greet, you need to stay in your seats after the last question. There'll be a separate announcement for the meet and greet shortly, so please wait for that. And there's also tour editions of Dawkins' new book, The Genetic Book of the Dead, available at the merch stand. So hold tight in your seats. We'll announce the meet and greet after the Q&A. So I wanted to just briefly outline, because I tend to deal with a lot of these cases in court cases defending the reality of biological sex, so I really get a front row seat at what the so-called experts on the other side are actually saying about what sex is and what isn't. And so I'm going to paint just a brief picture and then ask you the final question. So it's much more complex and crazy than you might actually imagine. It's not merely that sex isn't real. There's a systematic way they go about it. So they have this view that bodies don't have a sex, but individual traits do, or kind of do. But sex is a multi-variable thing. It's multi-trait with spectrum of maleness and femaleness. Spectrum of maleness and femaleness occurring for each trait. No trait has more weight than any other trait when trying to decide the sex of an individual, except for the brain, which sometimes expert reports will say that this is an individual's true sex. They say that the sexes aren't really real. They're just labels that we put on arbitrary clusters of traits. We can't talk about males and females, but rather degrees of maleness and femaleness as sort of a statistical sum total of every bit you can possibly measure on somebody. And based on this, so if you believe this, your brain can therefore have a different sex than your body does. And since your body's sex is just a bunch of different traits, all of which can be modified, you can actually literally change your sex, push yourself along the sex spectrum to have your body's sex match your brain's statistical sex. So that's what they think. This might sound like some Alex Jones stuff, and it kind of is, and it's articulating it to a crowd, makes me sound like I got a tinfoil hat on myself. So I guess my last question for you here is, what do you think is worse? Denial of evolution, which can be kind of esoteric and further removed, or the denial of biological sex, or at least believing the list of things I just did? If you could hand wave away one type of delusion, what would it be?
I think denial of evolution is worse. This is a straight factual denial. But I think that the postmodern tendency to regard human beliefs, and especially political beliefs, as somehow having more priority over scientific facts, which is what lies behind the trans point you're making. I think that is pernicious in a different way.
Yeah, I go back and forth between which one. I think maybe the sex one has more immediate consequences in everyday life.
Absolutely. But, yes.
But I mean, ultimately, these are both. The reason I push back on both these is they're both fundamental aspects of who we are as beings. Evolution is within every cell of our body. We come from this unbroken chain of individuals, and then probably a close second fundamental fact of our existence is the fact that we're a sexual species. We're sexually dimorphic, and then in some contexts, certainly not all contexts, that sexual dimorphism matters and requires some sort of
yes. I think it's especially pernicious, as I said before, in muscling in on, literally muscling in on athletic events, and also more or less seizing children when they're too young to really know, and it kind of indoctrinating them with the view that the sex that they were, quote, assigned at birth is something that is up for debate later on when they really decide for themselves what gender they are. And I think that this is a corruption of childhood, which is wicked.
Yeah. Well,
especially when it actually leads to physical consequences like hormone treatment and surgery, actually removing the breasts of girls who have this internal belief that they've picked up from other people that they really are boys.
Well, I have to say we're thrilled that you've thrown your hat into the ring on this topic, because there's a lot of people that have been talking about this. I've been writing about it since 2018, and it's always great to have someone like you with your career weigh in on these issues. So thank you for that. So now we're going to move on to the Q&A portion. Okay, so again, if you had a question, you could line up over there. So we can just start taking questions now. So I would hope you just please make it a question as quickly as you can. Try not to pontificate too much, but...
Can we have the lights up? Is that
yes.
possible?
Dr. Dawkins, what an immense honor it is. I'm sure I'm in good company here of people who will be unable to articulate our immense gratitude for your entire career and your advocacy for reason and logic, and atheism and science. I cannot tell you what an impact you've had on my own personal life. I'd like to ask you about a relatively new theory, perhaps, called assembly theory. I don't know if you have too much familiarity with it, but it is generally an extension, perhaps, of Darwinian theory in the sense that it opens up Darwinian theory to things outside of DNA. For example, tables can, have the shape that they have because they have survived the battle of the fittest to become a sort of a table that is fit to be a table. And also ideas, democracy and capitalism have fought in this idea space in order to have survived and become fittest. Is it possible that Darwinian theory or Darwinian fact is applicable to things like memes and can survive outside of just...
Well, that's the whole point of the meme idea, that they could be Darwinian but not DNA. When you talk about ideas that have survival value, that really rings a bell. That's the whole point of the meme theory. Whether they actually give rise to evolutionary change of the kind that builds complicated bodies like Darwinian selection, that's another matter. I think the nearest approach to that would be meme complexes, which things like an organized religion, which is a society of memes that are mutually supportive of each other. And I think that's probably the way to go. I've written a paper called Universal Darwinism, which argues that if there is life on other planets elsewhere in the galaxy, in the universe, it will be Darwinian life, because the only way to build complexity is something equivalent to Darwinism. So yes, my answer to your question is yes. Don't applaud. It's not.
Hello, Mr. Dawkins. My name is Mahesh. I want to ask you a question from a philosophical perspective.
Oh dear.
Yeah, which I gather that you seem to have been quite critical of. Well, that's why I'm asking a question. In The Selfish Gene, as well as other books, you have emphasized the role of genes in shaping behavior through natural selection. From my philosophical perspective, which is grounded in Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason and David Hume's skepticism, specifically David Hume's skepticism of empiricism. I view knowledge, epistemic knowledge, as a synthesis of a priori structures and a posteriori experiences. Since evolutionary biology and specifically ethology rely heavily on behavioral studies and empirical generalization, do you believe that this method of believing in empirical generalization provides us with objective knowledge about human beings? Or would you agree that empirical methods offer primarily probabilistic insights, leaving room for skepticism about their objectivity?
I have to confess that I don't understand what you're saying.
Well, I'm trying to.
I realize you're learned in philosophy. I'm not. I can't answer that question.
I'm sorry, I'm not. What I'm trying to ask you is, how much room do you hold in asserting the scientific knowledge based in empirical or behavioral studies? How much skeptical are you about, for example, evolution?
What do you say? I mean, how could it not be empirical? I don't understand what.
Well, because primarily you say you're ethologist, and that is the behavioral studies, and that is based in empirical analysis of obviously behaviors. So, from David Hume's, the skepticism of empiricism gives us only the knowledge of isness, and the reasoning that you're putting on the isness is only what you are trying to make. Basically, from Kant's perspective, you are trying to go into the illusion, transcendental illusion, when you're trying to push your reasoning on the isness of the natural world.
I can't cope with this isness business. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
I'm not.
I'm
learned.
sorry.
Yeah.
I don't know any philosophy.
Okay.
I beg your pardon for it. Let's have the next question.
I appreciate the attempt. We're gonna move on to the next one.
I understand the scientific method for determining scientific truth. What's the method for determining moral truth? And is there such a thing? And that's how you ask a question.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for that. This is something where science itself can't actually give the answer, but the scientific method in the form of moral philosophy can, given certain premises, certain axioms, can lead to reasoning, scientific or quasi-scientific reasoning about moral questions. So what moral philosophers can do is to point up contradictions. If you think that so-and-so is wrong, then you're contradicting yourself if you think that this over here is right. So there is a large literature on moral philosophy, which I think is a kind of science. And it has to start from some kind of axiom like suffering is wrong, or human suffering is wrong, or suffering by sentient beings is wrong. And those will give different answers. But if you start with one of those premises, then you can work out theories of morality in a kind of scientific way. But I would not say that science itself can answer questions about what is right and what is wrong.
Dr. Dawkins, an honor. You've really changed my life from being a Catholic apologist to being a rationalist. So thank you. My question is, these days I encounter a lot of my friends who dabble in the realm of spirituality while they easily adapt or embrace Eastern myths while they basically denounce Western religions and any other religion as such. The challenge in talking to them and trying to reason with them is that they bring new concepts that a simple man like me does not understand, like quantum physics. Suddenly everyone seems to be an expert in quantum physics to support to support theories like, especially the so-called ancient wisdom or mumbo-jumbos, like pyramids are built by aliens and all those things. But my question is, when people talk about such kind of scientific principles that most of us don't understand and bring that as evidence and showcase a few doctors here and there who support those theories, how do simple folks like me counter it? How would you tell us to counter it?
Very sympathetic. It is true that quantum physics is deeply mysterious, and certain things that Indian mystics say is deeply mysterious. It doesn't mean that they are in any sense connected. The difference is, and the same goes for any of the so-called mysteries of religion. You don't have to single out Indian mystics. The same is true of Christian and etc. The difference is that, mysterious and baffling though the premises of quantum theory are, they lead to predictions which are fulfilled to the umpteenth decimal place. So much so that Richard Feynman was able to say that the predictions of quantum theory, the fulfilled predictions of quantum theory, are equivalent to predicting the width of North America to the nearest hair's breadth. Now that's an impressive achievement, and however mysterious quantum theory may be, it must have something going for it. If it can make predictions that are fulfilled to that level of accuracy, in some sense it's got to be true. And so we have to come back and admit that if we don't understand the theory itself, things like that a particle can be in two places at once, and it matters whether there's an observer there or not. These are deeply mysterious, but they carry the credentials of these fantastically accurate predictions. They have to be taken seriously in a way that religious mysticism doesn't, because it doesn't make any predictions at all, let alone verifiable ones.
Hello there, Dr. Dawkins. This might seem like a somewhat waste of a question, but it is a life question. I want to ask you because I feel like this will be the only opportunity in which I will ever get to speak to you. I would like to know, what is one of the best pieces of life advice that you've been given, and what is your favorite piece of life advice to give? I
hate the advice question. Don't pick up viruses like the one I've got at the moment. I'm not some kind of guru who can go around dispensing advice. What do you think I am? I mean,
it doesn't have to be the best, just your favorite.
Okay. Well, be honest and don't fake things. Don't be pretentious. Don't be obscurantist. Speak truth honestly in language that you understand and you hope other people understand.
Thank you very much. I hope you get to feeling better.
Sorry you aren't feeling well. Thanks for hanging in there. I really like religion myself. I find it very wholesome to pray, and I don't actually have an expectation that there's a God listening. I just find it useful for my own purposes. Religious music, I think, is just better than secular music. The religious art is, I'll say it, the best art. If you're an atheist, what is your response to this? Do you just cross your arms and say harumph when Messiah comes on?
I like you. I mean, I love the Messiah. I love the B minor Mass. I love the St. Matthew Passion, St. John Passion. Religious music is wonderful, and I can empathize with it, not just as music, but even with the with the story of the Passion of Jesus, for example. It suits you, it's comforting for you, and you like the music and you like the art, but none of that makes it true.
Not true, but not bullshit, huh?
Well, I mean, to some people, the question whether it's true is not an important question. For some people, they don't care if it's true. They only care if it's comforting, for example, or if the music is good. I like the music, I like the art, but what I really care about is the truth. I want to know whether Jesus really did rise from the dead. I want to know whether he really was born of a virgin. And I find it evasive when religious people say, well, in a symbolic sense he did, or something like that. I mean, either he did or he didn't. And I think it really matters. So while I agree with you about the music and great cathedrals, I mean, it's a wonderful experience to go to and visit a great cathedral like Salisbury or Canterbury. But always I come back to the question, is it true? And I don't believe you think it is.
No, thank you.
Hi, huge fan of both of you. This could be a question I'd be interested in either of your thoughts on, or both. I hold gender-critical beliefs, and I've noticed that I've had to sharpen up my thoughts about those beliefs when they collide with the beliefs of gender ideologues. And it's forced me to think about what underlies a lot of those beliefs, and some of them are definitional. What is a man? What is a woman? Colin, I'm familiar with your definitions, something to the effect of, I'll butcher it, the body plan of someone who would or could produce one or the other gamete. What ends up happening is we get to the edge cases, right, and intersex conditions, but one that I'm interested in is people who produce no gametes. And a lot of times that seems like a kind of a trump card for them, but I prefer your definition as it relates to what is important in society, which I think is the dimorphism, and I think that extends to preferences and behaviors from an evolutionary perspective. But that is an analysis, there's a way of looking at sex as it's useful. But then I think about the definition of sex itself, and I think about sex evolving and anisogamy evolving from eukaryotes, where there's not this great multicellular complex organism where you get all of these downstream sex differences. Excuse me. The question is, might it be appropriate to say that people who do not produce gametes actually do not have a sex, because the gamete is what is really how we are defining sex at its core, and not the downstream sex differences in the phenotype?
I think you have to say that it's the potential to produce gametes of a certain type. I mean, if we don't have to stick with humans. Humans is only one species after all, out of millions, billions actually, if you count extinct ones. Worker bees are sterile females. We call them female. They are potentially queens. If a sterile worker who doesn't produce gametes was fed a different diet on royal jelly, she would be a queen. She would have been a queen. That illustrates the point about potential to produce macrogametes. She has no potential to produce microgametes at all. She's definitely female. She's a sterile female with no gametes. Worker termites include both sterile females and sterile males. And again, we use this criterion of potential. So the fact that there are some humans who don't produce gametes is really a trivial point.
I would say that I myself use slightly different language. I tend to use, instead of potential, I use functional language sometimes when I describe it. Like I would say that a male is someone who has the function to produce sperm with the acknowledgement that having a function to do something doesn't mean that you are currently functioning at that thing. Like, so we can talk about an automobile or a bicycle. Okay, we can get to the next question. So, yeah, so you're still male or female if you just have the function to produce these things, even if you're not currently working.
Thank you both very much.
Professor Dawkins, thank you for choosing Portland. Really glad you did. This is a great honor for me. You've described genes and memes as fundamental drivers of both biological and cultural evolution, the pinnacles of which are arguably human intelligence and modern society, respectively. Given this critical role that information plays within these contexts, do you see consciousness as an emergent phenomenon, born of evolving information systems, analogous to genes and memes? And if so, do you think evolving information systems may give rise to conscious man-made entities someday?
I think consciousness is the biggest riddle facing biology. It's very difficult to understand what it is and what its importance is. I think it's not difficult to imagine a totally unconscious robotic animal which does everything necessary to survive and reproduce without being conscious. And so it's hard to know what consciousness is all about. As to whether human machines will one day be conscious, they already seem to me to be passing the Turing test with flying colors. I mean, I've interacted a bit with two of the available AIs, and in both cases I've felt it almost impossible to believe that this is not a conscious being that I'm talking to. Actually, I think they're not conscious, but it seems to be probable that one day they will be, and it may be that we will all go extinct, and what will be left will be our robotic successors, that are artifacts that we've created.
Thank you.
Don't applaud, isn't it?
Is it, I can't tell if it's working. Okay, it's working. So super hyped to be here, you know. I want to go back to Stephen and Gould and what you're talking about with like Wonderful Life and the idea of like rapid steps in evolution. And I want to use an example that's not in the book, but it's like my own like interest because I want to do paleontology and like related to mammals. So for like right after the dinosaurs, right? You know, there's a meteor, like everything went extinct, and there's the rapid diversification of mammal morphologies. And I don't really see how that's not an example of like the rapid evolution that Gould was talking about. And it's true that like mammals were always evolving like physiologically, specifically like cranial anatomy, like throughout the Mesozoic was always like evolving. We have plenty of evidence of that. But there is a clear distinction between like the morphological diversity of mammals in the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic. And there's a clear like period of time where that became like evident. So I want to like just ask like, is that not like an example? I want you to like elaborate more on like why you disagree with his idea.
All I'm saying is that Gould was talking about three different kinds of jump.
Okay.
And they're all valid. They're all true. It's just that they're not the same thing, and you shouldn't muddle them up by calling them all the same thing.
Okay.
That's all.
Okay.
I agree with you.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Thank you.
How you doing, Richard? It's a pleasure to see you tonight. So my question here is about artificial intelligence. In the future, I think we all know the artificial intelligence is going to get better at making predictions, but they also have a tendency to hallucinate, and that doesn't look like it's going away either. So when it comes to producing predictions in science, these artificially intelligent machines are going to be very, very powerful and might be able to predict missing links in the fossil record, right? But it also might bake into it hallucinations that could be harmful to our understanding of evolution and life and humanity. But they'll be crunching such big numbers that you or I cannot do by ourselves. How do we fight against the hallucinations that artificial intelligence...
What's an example of a hallucination?
So a hallucination is like, there was a case where a legal student or a lawyer, he actually put in ChatGPT to come up with a case, and ChatGPT just invented a bunch of legal cases that didn't exist, and he presented this in his disposition, and he got in trouble for it. So, for example, a hallucination in an evolutionary sense would be like, okay, so it successfully predicts what this ancestor looks like, and we found a fossil, right? But it produces a
lie.
Yes, a lie in it. But if it's dealing with these numbers, right, and data that our brains can't crunch because it's specialized, it's going to be more difficult for us to take that lie out.
Well, there's clearly a fault in the way it's written if it tells lies like that. I mean, when I spoke to ChatGPT, it told a less important lie, but I was talking about, I asked it about a geneticist called Helen Spurway, and she was a very good geneticist, and she died a long time ago. She was the wife of J.B.S. Haldane, who was an even greater geneticist. And ChatGPT said, after Haldane died, Helen Spurway married Richard Dawkins. And so I said, no, she didn't. And it said, more or less, oh, sorry, I got that wrong. She married Aldous Huxley. That was also false. So it seems to me that so impressive is the performance of these creatures that ironing out that problem, the problem of simply making stuff up, should be relatively simple.
All right, thank you.
Okay, we have time for one more question. And so before we get to that, I just want to remind again that the meet and greet ticket holders, stay in your seats until after the last question. We'll make an announcement for you later.
If you don't want what I've got, I advise you not to meet me.
Okay, the pressure's on. Hello, Dr. Dawkins. It's a pleasure to meet you. I wish you a speedy recovery, and it's an honor to stand here before each of you. It's entirely possible that some people here do not know that you participated and contributed to a heavy metal album called The Greatest Show on Earth by Nightwish. And so maybe this is a foil to the last music-related question, but what was it like for you to contribute to that album, and what was it like to contribute to an album in the heavy metal genre that describes the beauty of evolution?
Well, it was rather fun. I rather enjoyed it. I went to Wembley, a great big stadium in London, and they did their concert, which was very inspiring. And then at the end, I had to make a little recitation while they went on playing. I had to recite a speech from Macbeth, the tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech. And I was very nervous, so I couldn't really enjoy the concert as much as I would have done because I was nervous about having to do this. One of the things that struck me was that everybody had their iPhone up in the air like that. I mean, the whole stadium was filled with these little lights of smartphones, and they were filming the whole thing. And I thought it was rather spoiling it. Right? But it was a good experience. I enjoyed it.
Unfortunately, we can't take any more questions. So, Professor Dawkins, it was an absolute pleasure to chat with you tonight. I want everyone to give a round of applause. Please, this is Richard Dawkins' final bow, so please stand up and give a round of applause for Richard Dawkins.